It's funny the things you hold onto. I'm a graphic designer. I spend my days staring at pixels, adjusting kerning, making sure a client's logo is the exact right shade of Pantone blue. My world is supposed to be one of logic, of grids and guidelines. But for the last 6 years, the most real thing in my life has been the memory of sand. The scent of salt where there should be no salt, and the sound of whispers in a language I don't speak. This all started, as many questionable life choices do, with my uncle Frank. Frank was my mom's older brother, and he was different. While my dad was teaching me how to file taxes, Frank was teaching me how to pan for gold in the American River. He was a desert rat, a modern-day prospector, a man whose skin was the texture of old leather from lifetimes spent under the California sun. He was obsessed with lost treasures and local legends, the kind of stories most people hear once and forget. Frank cataloged them. To him, they weren't just stories, they were unfinished adventures. His ultimate obsession, the one that gleamed in his eye even in his 70s, was the legend of the Perla de Arena, the pearl of the sand. The story changes depending on who's telling it, but the core is always the same. Sometime in the 17th century, a Spanish galleon loaded with pearls and gold from the New World was sailing up the Gulf of California. A freak tidal bore, a massive wave caused by the unique geography of the Colorado River Delta back then, supposedly carried the ship miles and miles inland, stranding it in the vast, unforgiving expanse that would one day become the Anza Borrego Desert. The crew, lost and dying of thirst, either perished or were killed by the local tribes. The ship, and its treasure, were swallowed by the shifting sands. Most people dismiss it as a tall tale, a campfire story born from heatstroke and wishful thinking. But Frank believed. He'd spent 30 years collecting every scrap of information he could find: old maps, Spanish missionary journals, geological surveys. His prized possession was a brittle, yellowed piece of vellum he'd bought from a shady antiquities dealer in Mexico. It was supposedly a copy of a map drawn by a dying survivor. It was mostly indecipherable, but Frank was convinced he'd cracked it. In the summer of 2018, he called me. His voice, usually a low, dusty rumble, was crackling with an energy I hadn't heard in years. "Jake, my boy," he said, "I've found it. I've cross-referenced the star charts with the geological markers. It's real. I know where she is." I was 28 at the time, working a dead-end job, and craving something, anything, to break the monotony. His excitement was contagious. So, I said yes. We weren't going alone. Frank knew his limits. He brought in Dave, a retired Army mechanic who owned a heavily modified Jeep Wrangler built for serious off-roading. Dave was the pragmatist, a stout man with a no-nonsense attitude who seemed to view the whole thing as a fun logistical challenge. He packed enough water, food, and emergency supplies to last a month. He didn't believe in ghost ships, but he believed in being prepared. The final member of our little fellowship was a woman Frank had consulted with, Dr. Maria Flores. She was a history professor at UCLA, specializing in colonial Spanish dialects. She was sharp, professional, and initially, very skeptical. Frank had shown her his map, and while she couldn't verify its authenticity, the linguistic clues in the margins intrigued her. She agreed to come along, framing it as academic field research, a chance to investigate a persistent local myth. But I could see a spark of adventure in her eyes, too. So that was our crew. The believer, the mechanic, the academic, and me, the chronicler. I guess I brought my camera, thinking I'd document a quirky desert adventure with my eccentric uncle. I had no idea I was about to document the complete unraveling of my reality. We set off from a small town on the edge of the Salton Sea. A strange, dying body of water that already feels like the end of the world. The air smelled of salt and decay. As we drove east, deeper into the desert, the last vestiges of civilization vanished. Paved roads gave way to dirt tracks, then to nothing but a GPS coordinate on Dave's dashboard. The desert is a place of profound emptiness. The heat is a physical presence, pressing down on you. The sky is a vast, empty blue canvas. In every direction, there was nothing but cracked earth, sun-bleached rock formations, and the occasional hardy creosote bush. The silence was absolute. broken only by the roar of the Jeep's engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. We'd listened to classic rock on a portable speaker, the familiar tunes of Creedence Clearwater Revival sounding thin and out of place in the immense quiet. For 2 days, we saw nothing. We'd drive, navigate, make camp, and do it all over again. Frank would stare at his map, then at the distant mountain ranges, muttering to himself. Dave would check the Jeep, making sure our lifeline was secure. Maria would take soil samples and make notes. Ever the scientist, I took pictures of the stark, beautiful landscape. Despite the heat and the futility, there was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. It was an adventure. We were living a story. On the third morning, everything changed. Frank was up before dawn, standing on the hood of the Jeep with a pair of binoculars, scanning the horizon as the first purple light of sunrise bled into the sky. "There," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. He handed me the binoculars. "Look, just to the left of that tall rock formation. The one that looks like a man's face." I lifted the binoculars, my hands a little shaky. I scanned the rock line, my eyes gritty from the dust. And then I saw it. It was just a sliver. A dark line that didn't belong. It was too straight, too regular to be a rock. A glint of something caught the rising sun. It wasn't metal. It looked like wood. My heart started hammering against my ribs. "No way," I breathed. Dave and Maria were awake now, drawn by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Dave took the binoculars. His usual stoic expression cracked. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice a low whistle. It's a mast." It took us another 2 hours of careful, bone-jarring driving to get there. The closer we got, the more impossible it seemed. It wasn't just a mast. Emerging from a massive sand dune, like the skeleton of some colossal prehistoric beast, was the unmistakable shape of a ship's bow. A Spanish galleon. Its dark, weathered wood impossibly preserved, sat half buried in the sand, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. We stopped the Jeep about 100 yards away and just stared. The silence was back, but this time it was different. It was a heavy, sacred silence. We were standing in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. The ship was huge, maybe 100 feet long. Even with its stern and lower hull buried, it was tilted at a severe angle, listing to its port side. We could see the ornate carvings on the prow, eroded by centuries of sand and wind but still visible. The wood was black and hard as iron. The dry air, it preserved it, Maria said, her voice filled with awe. "It's like a mummy, a wooden mummy." Frank was openly weeping, tears carving clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He'd spent his whole life chasing this. And here it was. His myth was real. For the rest of that day, we were like kids on Christmas morning. The initial shock gave way to pure, unadulterated excitement. We explored the exterior, marveling at the sheer, blatant impossibility of it all. We took measurements, took hundreds of photos. The treasure was almost an afterthought. The ship was the treasure. We set up our camp in its shadow, the massive, dark hull blocking the harsh afternoon sun. The plan was to wait for the temperature to drop, then attempt to go inside. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor, the mood was euphoric. Dave cracked open a couple of celebratory beers, and we sat around our small campfire, the flames dancing and painting the ship's bow in flickering orange light. We were going to be famous. Rich, maybe, but definitely famous. And that's when the first red flag appeared. It was subtle, so subtle that, at the time, I barely registered it. We were laughing at a story Frank was telling about a run-in with a Gila monster back in the 80s. In a lull in the conversation, a quiet moment, I heard it, a sound. It was a faint, whisper-thin sound, like a sigh. It seemed to come from the direction of the ship. "You guys hear that?" I asked. Frank shook his head. "Hear what?" "Just the wind. Sun always plays tricks on you out here." Dave grunted in agreement. "Critter, maybe, coyote." Maria didn't say anything. She was just looking at the ship, her brow furrowed. I followed her gaze. The ship was a black monolith against the star-dusted sky. The campfire light made it look like it was breathing. For a fleeting second, I had the distinct, chilling sensation that we were being watched. A primal feeling, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. It felt like we were small animals, huddled around our fire, while a great, ancient predator watched us from the darkness. Waiting. I shook it off. Frank was right. It was the wind, the desert, my overactive imagination. I took a sip of my beer and forced a laugh, rejoining the conversation, but I kept glancing back at the ship, and the feeling didn't entirely go away. The first thread of unease had been woven into our triumph. The next morning, we went in. Dave had a set of climbing ropes and harnesses. We secured a line to a thick, sturdy-looking railing on the main deck, which was tilted at a precarious 45-degree angle. Dave, being the most experienced and physically capable, went first. He rappelled down onto the slanted deck, his boots thudding softly on the ancient wood. "It's solid," he called up, his voice echoing slightly. "Smells weird, though, like old wood and the beach." The beach. We were in the middle of a desert. One by one, we made our way onto the ship. Stepping onto that deck was like stepping into another time. The air was still and strangely cool, a stark contrast to the baking heat outside. And Dave was right about the smell. It was a bizarre combination of bone-dry decay, creosote, and the unmistakable, briny tang of saltwater and low tide. It made no sense. My brain kept trying to reject it, to find a rational explanation. But there was none. We moved slowly, carefully. The deck planks groaned under our weight but held firm. We found the main hatch leading below deck. It was a heavy wooden grate, swollen shut. It took the combined effort of Dave and Frank, using a crowbar, to pry it open with a deafening shriek of tortured wood. The darkness that greeted us was absolute. It was a thick, physical darkness that seemed to swallow the light from our headlamps. And the smell that wafted up was stronger, more intense, salt, rot, and something else. Something metallic and vaguely unpleasant, like old blood. Frank, holding a powerful lantern, went first. The rest of us followed, our headlamp beams cutting frantic, nervous paths through the gloom. We were in what looked like the gun deck. Cannons still sat in their positions, thick with dust and grime, their muzzles aimed at a sea of sand. Rotted rope and scraps of canvas littered the floor. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that seemed to absorb the light. We explored for hours, moving through the ship like ghosts ourselves. We found the crew's quarters, with their rows of hammocks that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. We found the galley, with clay pots and rusted utensils still in their places. It was a perfect, silent time capsule. The second red flag came when we found the captain's cabin. It was at the stern of the ship, larger and more ornate than the other rooms. A large wooden desk sat against one wall, a high-backed chair before it. On the desk, amongst the clutter of navigational tools and what looked like a disintegrated logbook, sat a simple pewter cup. What was wrong with it? It was clean, not sparkling clean, but it had no dust on it. None. In a room where every other surface was caked in a thick, undisturbed blanket of gray, this one cup looked as if it had been set down only moments ago. "That's odd," Maria said, her light tracing the cup's rim. "Maybe another explorer found this place," Dave suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Years ago, left it behind, and it hasn't gathered a speck of dust since?" I asked. The air in the cabin felt heavy, colder than the rest of the ship. I could see my own breath misting in my headlamp beam. Frank, ever the believer, had a different take. "The spirits," he said, his voice low and reverent. "They're still here. They're tidy." He seemed pleased by the idea. I was not. We didn't find the main treasure hold that day. We decided to head back to camp before dusk, our bags filled with a few small, carefully chosen artifacts: a brass button, a rusted belt buckle, a Spanish coin from 1612 we found on the floor. The euphoria of the previous day was gone, replaced by a strange mixture of awe and a low-grade, simmering anxiety. The ship was incredible, a historical marvel, but it also felt wrong. It felt watchful. That night, the real terror began. The sun set, and the temperature dropped. We built our campfire again, but the mood was subdued. We ate our dinner mostly in silence, the massive, dark shape of the ship looming over us. The whispers started around 9 p.m. At first, it was just like the night before, a faint sigh on the wind. But this time, it didn't stop. It was a low, continuous murmuring, just at the edge of hearing. It sounded like multiple voices, all talking at once. Okay, that's not the wind, Dave said, setting his plate down. He was holding a large wrench from his toolkit, his knuckles white. Maria's face was pale. She was listening intently, her head cocked. It's Spanish, she whispered. Old Castilian, I think. The pronunciation is archaic. What are they saying? Frank asked, his eyes wide. I can't make it out, she said, shaking her head. It's too faint. It's like listening to a radio station from very far away. The murmuring continued, a constant, unsettling chorus. It would rise and fall, but it never ceased. It was coming from the ship. There was no doubt about it now. We were all staring at the dark hull, every nerve on high alert. Then, we saw the light. A faint, yellow light flickered to life in one of the Sterncastle windows, the window of the captain's cabin. It was a soft, unsteady glow, exactly like a candle or an oil lantern. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. We just sat there, frozen, staring at the light. It swayed gently for about a minute, as if someone were carrying it across the room. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. Okay, Dave said, his voice a strained whisper. That's it. We need to talk about what we're doing here. Frank was agitated. It's a sign. They're showing themselves. They're accepting us. Accepting us? Or telling us to get the hell out? Dave shot back. They're just spirits. David, they can't hurt us. You don't know that, Frank. While they argued, Maria grabbed my arm. Her hand was ice cold. Jake, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the ship. The whispers, they got clearer, just for a moment, when the light was on. What did you hear? I asked, my throat tight. She swallowed hard. Her academic curiosity was gone, replaced by pure, naked fear. I heard one phrase, a man's voice, very clear. El oro no es para ti. What does it mean? It means, she said, her voice trembling, the gold is not for you. A cold dread washed over me, colder than the desert night. This wasn't a historical curiosity anymore. This was a warning. The ship wasn't just a wreck, it was a tomb. And its occupants were still home. Sleep was impossible that night. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to move. The whispering never stopped, a constant, maddening murmur that gnawed at the edges of our sanity. We huddled together by the dying embers of the fire. 4 small, terrified people in a vast, ancient wilderness, watched by a vessel of the dead. The logical part of my brain, the part that designs logos and follows brand guidelines, was screaming at me. It was trying to find explanations. A trick of the acoustics. Other people, squatters, living in the ship. But the other part of my brain, the ancient, primal part, knew better. It knew we had stumbled into a place we were not meant to be. A place where the normal rules of the world had ceased to apply. I don't know why we went back in the next day. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was Frank's obsessive conviction. Maybe it was a morbid curiosity that outweighed our fear. Or maybe, just maybe, the ship was already calling to us, pulling us back in. The atmosphere inside the ship was different. The air was colder, heavier. The silence was gone, replaced by a low, almost sub-audible hum. It felt like standing inside a giant electrical transformer. And there were sounds. The distinct, unmistakable creak of a floorboard from the deck above. A soft thud from deep within the cargo hold. It was as if the ship was waking up around us. Frank was a man possessed. He was convinced the treasure was in a hidden compartment in the main cargo hold. Based on a scribble on his map, he, Dave, and I went down, leaving Maria on the main deck. She refused to go any deeper into the ship's belly. She said the whispers were clearer down there, and she didn't want to hear what they were saying. The cargo hold was a vast, cavernous space, filled with the remains of rotted crates and barrels. We spent an hour tapping on the walls and floor, searching for a hollow sound. Finally, Frank let out a triumphant yell. Behind a stack of disintegrated barrels, a section of the floor planking sounded different. It took us 20 minutes with the crowbar to pry the planks up. Beneath them was a heavy trapdoor with a rusted iron ring. The 3 of us heaved on it, our muscles straining, with a groaning protest of ancient wood. It opened. The smell that hit us was overpowering. It was the smell of immense age, of stagnant air, and something else, a strange, Sweet, coppery odor. Frank shone his lantern down into the darkness. And there it was. The light reflected off 1,000 points of brilliance. It was a small, hidden compartment, no bigger than a closet. But it was filled with treasure. Wooden chests overflowing with gold coins. Silver bars tarnished black with age. Strings of pearls as big as marbles. And uncut gemstones that glittered like captive stars. For a moment, our fear was forgotten, replaced by a raw, primal surge of victorious greed. We laughed, we yelled, we clapped each other on the back. Frank was vindicated. The legend was true. Everything was real. Dave was the first to climb down. He dropped into the small space and let out a low whistle. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice echoing up to us. He picked up a handful of gold doubloons and let them run through his fingers. I was about to follow him when it happened. The ship groaned. It wasn't the normal creak of old wood. This was a deep, resonant, structural groan, like the sound of a living creature in pain. It seemed to come from the very keel of the ship. The entire vessel shuddered, and dust rained down from the ceiling. And then, with a deafening slam, the heavy trapdoor fell shut. We were plunged into absolute, total darkness. "Dave," I yelled. His name was swallowed by the oppressive black. "I'm here," his voice came back, muffled, from beneath the floor. "What happened? Get the door open." Frank and I scrambled for the trapdoor, our hands padding frantically in the dark. But our lanterns had fallen, and we couldn't see anything. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed into my chest. "Stay calm," Frank yelled, his voice tight with fear. "We'll get it open." But we couldn't. It was as if the door had been fused shut. We pulled and heaved, but it wouldn't budge. Then the sounds started, not the whispers anymore. These were clear sounds, right there in the hold with us. The sound of bare feet shuffling on the wooden floor. The wet, hacking cough of a sick man. A low, mournful song being hummed by a woman. From below us, Dave started screaming. It wasn't a yell for help. It was a raw, terrified shriek of pure horror. "Get it off me," he screamed. "Oh God, get it off me. Dave, what is it? What's happening?" I yelled, pounding my fists on the trapdoor. His screams turned into wet, gurgling sounds. And then, silence. "Dave?" Frank whispered. The only reply was a soft, scraping sound from beneath the door. The sound of something being dragged across the floor. Frank and I were paralyzed, crouched in the suffocating darkness, listening. The humming, the coughing, the shuffling. It was all around us now. I could feel a change in the air. A drop in temperature so profound it felt like a physical blow. I fumbled for my headlamp, my fingers clumsy and numb. I finally found the switch and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. And I wished to God it hadn't. Standing not 10 feet from us were 3 figures. They were translucent, like smoke given human form. I could see the far wall of the hold right through them. They were dressed as sailors, in ragged, rotted clothes. Their forms shimmered and warped, but their faces were clear. They were gaunt, emaciated, with skin the color of seafoam and eyes that were black. Empty pits. One of them, the one who was coughing, had a dark, spreading stain on his tunic. They weren't looking at us. They were looking at the trapdoor. As we watched, one of them, a tall, skeletal figure, raised a shimmering hand and pointed at it. A voice echoed through the hold, but it didn't enter through my ears. It bloomed inside my head. A cold, clear thought that was not my own. Ladrones. Thieves. I finally found my voice and screamed. Frank screamed with me. We scrambled backward, away from the apparitions, crab walking through the filth on the floor until our backs hit the far wall. The figures began to drift towards us. Slow and silent, they made no sound, but the feeling of utter despair and malevolence that rolled off them was a physical force. Suddenly, a shaft of light cut through the gloom from above. It was Maria. She was screaming our names from the main hatch. "Jake, Frank, the storm. A sandstorm is coming. We have to go." The storm. The word broke the spell. The primal urge to survive, to flee, overrode the paralysis. I don't remember making a conscious decision. One moment I was pressed against the wall. The next I was on my feet, scrambling for the rope ladder leading out of the hold. "Frank, come on," I screamed, not daring to look back. I half climbed, half fell up the ladder, tumbling onto the gun deck. Maria was there, her face a mask of terror. "They're everywhere," she sobbed. "The whole deck." I looked. She was right. The main deck, visible through the hatchway, was swarming with them. Dozens of the shimmering, translucent figures, all standing silently, all turned towards us. They weren't trying to stop us. They were just watching. Frank came stumbling up the ladder behind me, his eyes wide with a madness I had never seen. He wasn't looking at me, or Maria. He was looking back down into the hold. "The gold," he whimpered. "Frank, forget the gold. We have to go now," I yelled, grabbing his arm. I dragged him towards the main hatch and the blessed sunlight. As we burst onto the deck, the world had transformed. The sky was gone, replaced by a churning, boiling wall of brown sand. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping at our clothes and stinging our faces. The sun was a pale, sickly disk. An unnatural, violent sandstorm had appeared from nowhere, surrounding the ship, trapping us in its vortex. We half ran, half slid down the slanted deck towards the rope we'd left dangling. The spectral sailors were all around us, silent sentinels in the swirling sand. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they just watched us with their dead, empty eyes. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. They weren't attacking us, they were hurting us. We scrambled down the rope, our feet hitting the desert floor. The jeep was barely visible, a faint outline 100 yards away. "This way," I yelled over the roar of the wind, pulling Frank along. Maria was right behind me. We ran blindly into the brown chaos, the sand scouring our skin. Behind us, I could hear a new sound mixed with the wind, the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, crunching in the sand right behind us. I didn't dare look back. I just ran. Maria screamed. I turned and saw her fall. Her ankle had twisted. I ran back and hauled her to her feet. Frank was just standing there, staring back at the ship, a strange, vacant look on his face. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Frank," I screamed, shaking him. His eyes focused on me for a second, and the terror returned. He started running again. We made it to the jeep, throwing ourselves inside and slamming the doors. The wind rocked the vehicle violently. The sand was so thick we couldn't see more than a foot in front of the windshield. We were safe, but we were trapped, and we were missing a man. Dave was gone. He was in the ship. He was with them. We stayed in that jeep for what felt like an eternity. The storm raged for hours. An unrelenting, furious assault. All we could do was sit there and listen to the wind howl. And sometimes, over the wind, we could hear the whispers. Right outside the windows, Maria sat in the back, curled into a ball, silently crying. Frank just stared blankly at the wall of sand, muttering to himself about pearls and tides. I think I passed out from sheer emotional exhaustion. When I woke up, it was silent. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived. The sun was setting, and the desert was calm and peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. And the ship was gone. I stumbled out of the jeep, my legs weak. I stared at the spot where the galleon had been. There was nothing there, no wreck, no hole in the sand, not even a splinter of wood, just the smooth, rolling expanse of the dune, untouched, as if it had lain that way for 1,000 years. Our camp was gone, our supplies, our tents, everything. Only the jeep remained. There were no footprints in the sand except for the ones leading directly from the non-existent ship to our vehicle. It was as if our entire experience had been a shared, collective hallucination. But we were out of water. And Dave was gone. We were found 2 days later by a park ranger on a routine patrol. He'd found us because Frank, in a moment of lucidity before we left, had logged our route and expected return date with the ranger station. We were severely dehydrated, sunburned, and in a state of shock. We told them everything. The ship, the treasure, the figures, the storm. We told them about Dave. They listened patiently, the way you listen to a traumatized child. They organized a search party. They flew helicopters. They swept the area on foot. They found nothing. No sign of a ship. No evidence of a campsite. No sign of Dave. The official report concluded that David Miller had likely wandered off and succumbed to the elements. and that the rest of us had suffered from severe heatstroke and dehydration, leading to shared hallucinations. Case closed. Frank was never the same. He was a hollowed-out man. His obsession, the thing that had driven him his entire life, had risen up and broken him. He was placed in a psychiatric facility a year later, where he would whisper stories of a golden ship to anyone who would listen, until he passed away in his sleep. Maria quit her job at the university. She moved to Oregon and changed her name. I tried to call her once. A few years ago, the woman who answered said I had the wrong number. And me? I moved away from California. I live in Chicago now. I try to fill my life with concrete and steel and noise. Anything to drown out the memory of that profound desert silence. I tell myself it was a dream, a hallucination, a story I invented. But some nights, when the wind blows a certain way against my apartment window, I can hear it, a faint, multi-layered whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, I'll catch a scent on the air, the smell of salt and old, dry rot. They never found any trace of Dave. I think I know why. I think back to the silent, watching figures on the deck. I think about the sounds we heard, the sounds of a full, living crew. The ship hadn't just been a tomb guarding its treasure. It was a prison, a vessel of souls cursed to sail an ocean of sand for eternity. And I can't shake the final, terrifying thought that has kept me awake for the past 6 years. Maybe the ship wasn't just a prison. Maybe it was always looking for a new crew. They took Dave, they filled a spot, and I know, deep in my bones, that they're still out there, somewhere, sailing on that phantom tide, waiting.